Maria's first mission began before dawn on a Monday morning that would change everything. She drove her modified van through the quiet city streets, heading toward the mountains as the sky slowly lightened from black to deep purple. The vehicle felt different now, heavier and more stable, but still familiar enough that she could sense every vibration through the steering wheel. The cargo bay was loaded with medical supplies, canned food, batteries, and communication equipment destined for the village of San Miguel. Population 800, located in a valley that had been cut off from the outside world for 5 weeks. Government intelligence indicated that rebel forces had destroyed the main bridge on the primary access road, forcing any supply missions to use a longer, more dangerous mountain route. For the first 3 hours, the journey proceeded smoothly. Maria followed highways she had never traveled before, watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to agricultural areas and finally to forested hills. The radio crackled occasionally with status updates from military command, but mostly she drove in focused silence, her senses alert to every detail of the road ahead. The paved highway ended at a small checkpoint manned by government soldiers. They examined her identification and mission documents carefully before waving her through onto a dirt road that immediately began climbing into serious mountain terrain. This was where her real test would begin. The road was worse than anything she had experienced during training. Sections had been washed out by recent rains, forcing her to navigate around deep ruts and fallen rocks. The van's reinforced suspension handled the punishment well, but Maria had to constantly adjust her speed and route to avoid damage that could strand her in hostile territory. After 2 hours of careful climbing, she reached a high ridge that offered her first view of the conflict zone below. Smoke rose from several locations in the distant valley, and she could see through binoculars that at least one village had been partially destroyed. The radio began picking up fragmentary transmissions from military units operating in the area, voices tight with stress reporting movements and requesting support. Maria consulted her map and realized she was approaching the most dangerous section of her route. For the next 20 kilometers, the road would wind through territory that changed hands regularly between government forces and rebels. Recent intelligence suggested it was currently clear, but outdated information could be fatal in rapidly changing situations. She made contact with military command to report her position and received the latest security updates. The response was not encouraging. There had been fighting in the area just 12 hours earlier, and while government forces claimed to control the route, there were reports of rebel scouts operating nearby. Command offered to delay the mission, but Maria knew that the medical supplies she carried were desperately needed by wounded civilians in San Miguel. Against her own survival instincts, she decided to continue. But she would need to modify her approach to reduce the risk of detection. Instead of following the main road directly, she would use a series of logging trails that paralleled the primary route, but offered better concealment. The path would be more difficult and take longer, but it might allow her to avoid any hostile forces that were monitoring the obvious approach. The logging trails tested every skill she had developed over years of city driving. The narrow paths twisted between massive trees, crossed streams on makeshift bridges, and climbed steep grades that pushed her modified engine to its limits. Several times she had to get out and clear fallen branches or rocks that blocked her way, always listening for sounds that might indicate she was not alone in the forest. During one of these stops, as she was moving a large branch that had fallen across the trail, Maria heard voices coming from somewhere ahead. She froze, listening carefully to determine their direction and distance. The voices were speaking in the local dialect, but she couldn't make out the words. More importantly, she couldn't tell if they belonged to government soldiers or rebel fighters. Moving as quietly as possible, she returned to her van and shut off the engine. The sudden silence seemed deafening after hours of mechanical noise. She could still hear the voices closer now and realized that someone was approaching along the trail. Her training had prepared her for this moment, but actually facing potential combat made her heart race with fear and adrenaline. Through the dense foliage, she caught glimpses of movement. 3 men in military-style clothing were walking slowly along the trail, carrying automatic weapons and examining the ground carefully. They appeared to be following tracks, possibly her own tire marks in the soft earth. One of them pointed toward her location and said something to his companions. Maria had seconds to make a decision that could determine whether she lived or died. Her training offered several options: She could attempt to hide and hope they passed by, try to escape by backing down the trail, or identify herself and hope they were friendly forces. Each choice carried potentially fatal risks. The approaching voices grew clearer, and she realized they were speaking in the clipped, disciplined manner of professional soldiers rather than the casual conversation of civilians. But that didn't necessarily mean they were government forces. Both sides in this conflict included trained military personnel, making a choice that surprised her with its boldness. Maria stepped out from behind her van with her hands clearly visible and called out in a steady voice that she was a government supply driver with medical cargo for San Miguel. The response would tell her whether she had just saved precious time or made a fatal mistake. The three men emerged from the forest with their weapons ready but not directly threatening. Their leader, a sergeant with weather-beaten features and tired eyes, examined her identification and mission documents, while his companions maintained watch on the surrounding area. After several tense minutes, he smiled for the first time and welcomed her as a fellow government operative. The soldiers provided valuable intelligence about conditions ahead and offered to escort her through the most dangerous section of the route. But Maria declined their protection, knowing that a group of armed men would be much more likely to attract hostile attention than a single civilian vehicle. She thanked them for the information and continued alone toward her destination. As afternoon faded toward evening, Maria finally saw the village of San Miguel, nestled in a valley below. The sight of her van approaching triggered immediate excitement among the residents, who had been surviving on dwindling supplies and hoping desperately for outside help. The successful completion of her first mission filled her with a satisfaction she had never experienced in her previous life. Maria Santos had always been invisible. At 23 years old, she worked as a delivery driver for a small logistics company in the bustling city of Manila. Every morning she would wake up at 5, put on her faded blue uniform and drive her old white van through the crowded streets. People barely looked at her when she delivered packages to their offices or homes. She was just another face in the crowd, another worker trying to make ends meet. Her colleagues at the company treated her politely, but never included her in their conversations. During lunch breaks, while the male drivers gathered around a small table sharing stories and jokes, Maria would sit alone in her van, eating her simple meal of rice and dried fish. She had grown used to this loneliness. It didn't bother her anymore, or at least that's what she told herself. Maria lived in a tiny apartment with her elderly mother, Rosa, who suffered from diabetes and high blood pressure. The medical bills were expensive and Maria's job barely covered their basic needs. She had dropped out of college 3 years earlier when her father died, leaving behind only debts and responsibilities. Her dreams of becoming a teacher seemed like a distant memory now. The van she drove was old and temperamental. The engine made strange noises, the air conditioning didn't work, and the brakes needed constant attention. But Maria had learned to understand every sound it made, every vibration that warned of trouble. She could fix minor problems herself, having watched mechanics work on various vehicles over the years. Her hands had become skilled at handling tools, though she never thought of this as anything special. Every day followed the same routine. She would collect packages from the warehouse, study her delivery route carefully, and set off into the chaotic traffic of the city. She knew every shortcut, every narrow alley that could save precious minutes during rush hour. Other drivers often got frustrated with traffic jams, honking their horns and shouting at other vehicles. Maria remained calm and patient, finding alternative routes that others overlooked. Her supervisor, Mr. Chen, was a stern man who rarely smiled. He appreciated Maria's punctuality and reliability but never praised her openly. She had never been late with a delivery, never damaged a package, and never received a complaint from customers. Yet when promotion opportunities arose, they always went to her male colleagues who were louder and more confident in expressing their ambitions. Maria's personal life was equally quiet. She had no close friends and hadn't been in a relationship for over 2 years. Her last boyfriend had left her when she refused to quit her job and focus on marriage and children. He couldn't understand why she insisted on working when he could provide for both of them. But Maria valued her independence even if it meant being alone. On weekends, she would take her mother to the local market or to medical appointments. Rosa often worried about her daughter's solitary life and would suggest that Maria should try to be more social, maybe join some community activities. but Maria felt more comfortable in the background, observing rather than participating. The only time Maria felt truly confident was when she was behind the wheel. Driving came naturally to her like breathing. She could navigate through the narrowest spaces, park in impossibly tight spots, and handle her vehicle with precision that amazed even seasoned drivers. Once she had helped a stranded motorist whose car had broken down in heavy rain. She had diagnosed the problem quickly and guided him through the repair process. The grateful man had offered her money, but she had refused, disappearing into the night before he could properly thank her. Her childhood had been different. Maria remembered being a bright, curious girl who asked endless questions and dreamed of adventures. She had loved reading stories about brave heroes in distant lands. But life had gradually worn down her confidence, replacing her boldness with careful caution. She learned to speak softly, to avoid drawing attention, to blend into the background. The political situation in their region had been tense lately. There were rumors of armed conflicts in the rural areas, but these seemed far removed from Maria's daily life in the city. She heard fragments of news on the radio while driving, stories about government forces clashing with rebel groups, but she didn't pay much attention. Politics felt like something that happened to other people, important people who made decisions that affected the world. Maria's van had become her sanctuary. Inside its worn interior, surrounded by packages and delivery forms, she felt purposeful and in control. The radio played softly, keeping her company during long drives. She had memorized the voices of different radio hosts and felt a strange connection to these strangers who filled her solitary hours with music and conversation. As evening approached each day, Maria would return to the warehouse, submit her delivery reports, and prepare for another identical tomorrow. She would drive home through the familiar streets, park outside her small apartment building, and climb the 3 flights of stairs to her mother's worried smile and questions about her day. Little did Maria know that her quiet, unremarkable life was about to change dramatically. The skills she had developed in her humble job, the roots she knew by heart, and the invisible presence she had cultivated would soon become crucial in ways she could never imagine. The ordinary woman who delivered packages would soon find herself at the center of extraordinary events. That night, as Maria helped her mother prepare dinner and listen to the evening news, she had no idea that within weeks, her name would be whispered with respect and fear across battlefields she had never seen. The driver no one noticed was about to become someone everyone would remember. The first sign that something had changed came on a Tuesday morning when Maria arrived at the warehouse to find it buzzing with unusual activity. Government officials in crisp uniforms were talking seriously with Mr. Chen, pointing at maps and making notes on clipboards. The other drivers stood around in small groups, whispering among themselves with worried expressions on their faces. Maria parked her van and walked quietly toward the building, hoping to understand what was happening without drawing attention to herself. She overheard fragments of conversation about supply routes being cut off, dangerous roads, and urgent deliveries that needed to reach remote areas. The word conflict was mentioned several times along with place names she recognized from recent news reports. Mr. Chen spotted her and called her over to his office. Inside, a stern-looking woman in military uniform sat behind his desk, studying a large map covered with red marks and arrows. The woman looked up as Maria entered, examining her with sharp, calculating eyes that seemed to see everything. The military officer introduced herself as Colonel Reyes. She explained that the ongoing conflict had disrupted normal supply chains to several isolated communities. Government forces needed reliable drivers who could navigate dangerous terrain and deliver essential supplies to areas where larger military convoys would be too conspicuous or vulnerable to attack. Maria listened carefully as Colonel Reyes described the mission. It involved driving through mountain roads that were poorly maintained and potentially monitored by hostile forces. The deliveries would include medical supplies, communication equipment, and food for both military outposts and civilian populations trapped in the conflict zone. The work would be dangerous, but the pay was significantly higher than her current salary. Most of her male colleagues had already declined the offer. They cited family responsibilities, safety concerns, or simply their reluctance to get involved in military operations. Maria understood their hesitation, but something inside her stirred as she listened to the colonel's description of communities cut off from vital supplies. of wounded soldiers and civilians who desperately needed help. Without fully understanding why, Maria found herself volunteering for the assignment. Colonel Reyes seemed surprised by her decision but quickly began explaining the details. Maria would receive basic training in defensive driving, emergency procedures, and communication protocols. Her van would be modified with reinforced panels, better suspension for rough terrain, and a secure communication system. That evening, Maria sat with her mother and explained the situation. Rosa was frightened and begged her daughter to reconsider. She reminded Maria of all the things that could go wrong, of families who had lost loved ones in the conflict. But Maria felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond her daily routine of delivering packages to office buildings. The training began the following week at a military facility outside the city. Maria learned how to handle her vehicle in extreme conditions, how to navigate using basic compass directions when GPS signals were unreliable, and how to respond to various emergency situations. She practiced driving on obstacle courses that simulated damaged roads, steep mountain paths, and areas where she might need to move quickly under pressure. The instructors were initially skeptical about her abilities. They had expected someone with military experience or at least a more imposing physical presence. But Maria's calm demeanor and natural driving skills quickly earned their respect. She absorbed information quickly and executed maneuvers with precision that impressed even the most experienced training officers. During weapons training, Maria learned to handle a basic sidearm, though she hoped she would never need to use it. The thought of potentially having to defend herself or others was sobering, but she approached this training with the same methodical dedication she brought to everything else. She practiced until her hands stopped shaking when she held the weapon, until loading and safety procedures became automatic. The modified van was ready after 2 weeks of preparation. The exterior looked almost the same as before, but the interior had been reinforced with lightweight armor plating. Additional fuel tanks had been installed to extend its range, and a sophisticated radio system allowed for encrypted communication with military command posts. Hidden compartments were built into the floor and walls for transporting sensitive materials. Maria's first mission was scheduled for the following Monday. She would drive north to a remote mountain village that hadn't received supplies in over a month. The route would take her through government-controlled territory initially, but the final stretch passed through areas where rebel forces were known to operate. Intelligence reports suggested the road was currently clear, but situations could change rapidly. As the weekend approached, Maria found herself both nervous and excited. She had spent her entire adult life following predictable routines, staying safely in the background of other people's stories. Now she was about to become an active participant in events that could affect the lives of people she had never met. She visited her mother's doctor to ensure Rosa had enough medication for several weeks, arranged for a neighbor to check on her regularly, and settled all her financial obligations. The military had provided a substantial advance payment, more money than Maria had ever seen at one time. She left most of it with her mother, keeping only what she needed for immediate expenses. On Sunday night, Maria couldn't sleep. She stood by her window looking out at the city lights, thinking about the mountain roads she would soon navigate, the people who were depending on supplies she would carry, and the risks she was about to face. For the first time in years, she felt truly awake, as if she had been sleepwalking through her previous life and was finally opening her eyes. The quiet delivery driver who had spent years blending into the background was about to discover what she was truly capable of when everything mattered. The success of Maria's first mission quickly led to more assignments, each one more challenging than the last. Word spread through military command about the quiet driver who could navigate impossible terrain and deliver supplies to places other drivers refused to go. Within 3 weeks, she had completed 7 missions, earning a reputation that reached far beyond her original unit. Colonel Reyes called her in for a special briefing after her return from delivering ammunition to a remote outpost that had been under siege for 6 days. The meeting took place in a secure facility, where maps covered every wall, marked with colored pins and string that traced the constantly shifting battle lines. Maria had never seen such a comprehensive view of the conflict that was reshaping her country. The colonel explained that intelligence had identified a critical situation developing in the eastern mountains. A government medical unit had been trapped in the town of Santa Rosa, after rebel forces overran their planned evacuation route. The medical team included 3 doctors, 2 nurses, and several wounded soldiers who could not be moved without proper transportation. Standard military rescue operations had failed because rebel forces controlled all the main access roads, but satellite imagery had revealed an old mining road that approached Santa Rosa from an unexpected direction. The route had been abandoned for over 20 years and was barely visible on current maps. Most military planners considered it impassable for vehicles, but Colonel Reyes believed that Maria's skills and her modified van might make the impossible journey feasible. The mission would be far more dangerous than anything Maria had attempted before. She would need to drive through territory that was completely controlled by hostile forces, using a route that might not actually exist anymore. If her van broke down or if she was discovered, there would be no possibility of rescue. The military could not risk larger forces for a single rescue operation, no matter how important. Maria studied the mission details for over an hour, asking technical questions about terrain conditions, weather forecasts, and communication protocols. The old mining road climbed to elevations where snow was possible even in summer, crossed streams that might be impassable after rain, and included several sections where the original route had been partially destroyed by landslides. Despite the enormous risks, she accepted the mission. Something inside her had changed over the past month. The timid delivery driver who had once avoided all confrontation now felt drawn to challenges that would have terrified her former self. She was discovering capabilities she never knew she possessed, finding courage in situations that demanded everything she could give. Preparation for the Santa Rosa mission took 3 days. Military engineers modified her van with additional equipment, including winches for self-recovery, extra fuel storage, emergency medical supplies, and a more powerful radio system for long-range communication. They also provided her with detailed topographical maps and satellite photos of the mining road. Though much of the information was decades old, the night before departure, Maria called her mother for what she knew might be their final conversation. She couldn't explain the specific nature of her mission, but Rosa seemed to understand that this assignment was different from the others. Her mother offered prayers and blessings, expressing pride in her daughter's service while trying to hide her own fears. Maria set out before dawn on a Thursday morning, driving first through familiar territory, before turning onto increasingly remote roads that led toward the eastern mountains. The last government checkpoint was manned by soldiers who looked surprised to see a civilian vehicle heading toward such a dangerous area. They offered final intelligence updates and wished her luck with the somber respect reserved for those undertaking missions with uncertain outcomes. The entrance to the old mining road was almost invisible, hidden behind overgrown vegetation and marked only by rusted metal posts that had once supported warning signs. Maria used her machete to clear enough brush to allow her van to pass, then began the slow ascent into terrain that had been untouched by human activity for decades. The road surface was worse than anything she had imagined. Sections had been completely washed away by seasonal floods, forcing her to create new paths around obstacles that would have stopped any normal vehicle. Her van's reinforced construction and specialized suspension allowed it to handle punishment that would have destroyed a standard automobile. But progress was measured in meters rather than kilometers. After 6 hours of constant struggle, she reached the highest point of the route where snow had indeed begun to fall despite the summer season. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and she could see her breath inside the van despite the heater running constantly. Visibility was reduced to just a few meters ahead, forcing her to rely on compass headings and intuition to stay on course. The descent toward Santa Rosa proved even more treacherous than the climb. The old road followed a narrow ledge carved into the mountainside, with steep drops that disappeared into fog-filled valleys below. Several times, sections of the road surface crumbled under her van's weight, forcing her to accelerate quickly across gaps that opened behind her wheels. Radio communication had been impossible since entering the mountains, leaving Maria completely isolated as she navigated through the most challenging terrain of her life. She had no way to know if the trapped medical team was still alive, if rebel forces had discovered her route, or if military command even knew her current status. As evening approached, she finally saw lights below that marked the town of Santa Rosa. But her relief was tempered by the realization that reaching the town was only the beginning of her mission. She still needed to locate the trapped medical team, load them and their patients into her van, and somehow return through the same impossible route while carrying additional passengers. The abandoned mining road had brought her to the outskirts of Santa Rosa undetected, but now she faced the challenge of entering a town controlled by hostile forces to rescue people whose exact location remained unknown. Everything she had accomplished so far would be meaningless if she failed in the crucial final phase of her mission. As darkness fell over the mountains, Maria Santos prepared to discover whether her remarkable journey had truly prepared her for the test that lay ahead. Maria parked her van in the shadow of an abandoned mining building on the outskirts of Santa Rosa and studied the town through binoculars as darkness settled over the valley. The streets below showed signs of recent fighting, with damaged buildings and burned vehicles scattered throughout the residential areas. Most concerning were the armed patrols moving systematically through the town, clearly searching for something or someone. Using her night vision equipment, she counted at least 30 rebel fighters positioned around the town center. Their deployment suggested they knew about the trapped medical team and were actively hunting for them. Maria would need to locate the government personnel and evacuate them without alerting the hostile forces to her presence or her escape. Route, her mission. Briefing had included emergency contact frequencies that the medical team would monitor if they were still operational. Maria set up her radio equipment and began transmitting carefully coded messages on multiple channels, hoping to establish contact without revealing her location to enemy forces, who might be monitoring the same frequencies. After 2 hours of patient attempts, she finally received a weak response from Dr. Martinez, the senior medical officer of the trapped unit. He reported that his team was hiding in the basement of the old church near the town square, along with 4 wounded soldiers who needed immediate evacuation. They had been without food for 3 days and were running low on medical supplies needed to keep their patients stable. The church was located in the center of town, surrounded by streets that were regularly patrolled by rebel forces. Maria would need to reach them without using her van, which would be too conspicuous and too noisy for a stealth approach. She would have to go on foot, carrying whatever supplies she could manage, and somehow guide the entire group back to her vehicle without being detected. Maria gathered essential medical supplies, food and water into a backpack that she could carry silently through the dark streets. She secured her van carefully, knowing that if anything happened to it, everyone would be stranded in hostile territory with no possibility of rescue. The return journey through the mountain mining road would be difficult enough with a full vehicle. Attempting it on foot would be impossible. Moving through Santa Rosa at night required every skill she had developed during her military training. She avoided main streets, staying in shadows and using damaged buildings for concealment as she worked her way toward the town center. Several times she had to freeze in place as patrol groups passed within meters of her hiding spots, their conversations revealing their frustration at being unable to locate their quarry. The old church sat on a small hill overlooking the main plaza, its bell tower silhouetted against the starlit sky. Maria circled the building carefully, identifying 3 different patrol routes that brought armed rebels close to the building at regular intervals. She would have a window of approximately 8 minutes between patrols to make contact with the medical team and assess their condition. Using hand signals she had learned during training, Maria approached the basement entrance and transmitted the agreed-upon recognition code on her handheld radio. The response came immediately, confirming that Dr. Martinez and his team were alive but in desperate need of evacuation. The wounded soldiers included one with a serious abdominal injury, who might not survive much longer without surgery. Dr. Martinez met her at the basement entrance, a tired man in his 50s whose medical uniform showed the strain of days spent hiding in primitive conditions. Behind him, Maria could see 2 nurses and several soldiers, including the wounded men who would need assistance to reach her van. The group was larger than she had expected, raising serious questions about whether her vehicle could carry everyone safely through the mountain terrain. After quick introductions, Maria explained her escape plan. The group would need to move in small segments to avoid detection, following a route she had mapped during her approach to the church. Her van was hidden approximately 2 kilometers away, but the journey would require crossing several streets that were under regular surveillance by hostile forces. Dr. Martinez expressed concerns about moving his most seriously wounded patient, but Maria convinced him that remaining in Santa Rosa would certainly result in capture or death for everyone. The rebel forces were clearly planning a systematic search of every building in town. and the church basement would not remain hidden much longer. They began the evacuation immediately, with Maria leading the first group, consisting of the 2 nurses and 1 ambulatory soldier. The wounded men would follow in a second group once she had confirmed that the route was clear and had brought her van closer to reduce the distance they would need to travel. The journey through the dark streets tested every aspect of Maria's training and natural instincts. She guided her charges through backyards, around damaged buildings, and across open areas during brief intervals between patrol sweeps. The nurses, though exhausted from days of stress and inadequate food, followed her instructions precisely and maintained the silence that was essential for avoiding detection. Reaching her van without incident, Maria immediately began preparing for the most difficult phase of the evacuation. She would need to drive closer to the church to collect the remaining members of the medical team, including the seriously wounded soldiers who could not walk the full distance. This would require bringing her vehicle into the edge of the town where it would be much more likely to be seen or heard by rebel patrols. While the nurses tended to their patients and prepared medical equipment for transport, Maria studied her maps one final time and planned the quickest route to the church that would minimize exposure to hostile observation. She would have only one opportunity to collect the remaining personnel before rebel forces could respond to any noise or sighting reports. Starting her van's engine seemed impossibly loud in the mountain silence, though she knew the sound would dissipate quickly in the open air. She drove slowly along dirt tracks and residential streets that had been abandoned since the fighting began, using her night vision equipment to navigate without headlights that would immediately reveal her presence. As she approached the church, Maria realized that the rebel patrols had changed their pattern. Instead of regular sweeps, they now appeared to be conducting a more intensive search that brought armed groups much closer to the building where Dr. Martinez and his remaining personnel were hiding. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she would need to extract everyone immediately, or risk losing them all to enemy capture. The woman who had once delivered packages through city traffic was now conducting a combat rescue operation in enemy territory, and everything depended on her ability to get everyone out alive. Maria arrived at the church just as rebel forces began their final sweep of the building. Through her night vision scope, she could see armed figures moving systematically through the structure, checking every room and closet. Dr. Martinez and his remaining team members had perhaps minutes before their basement hiding place would be discovered. Without hesitation, Maria drove her van directly to the basement entrance, abandoning all attempts at concealment. The noise of her engine immediately attracted attention from the rebel fighters inside the church, but she was committed now to a rescue that would succeed or fail within the next few minutes. Dr. Martinez emerged from the basement carrying one end of a stretcher bearing his most seriously wounded patient. The other end was supported by a young soldier whose own injuries made him barely capable of walking. Behind them came 2 more wounded men who could move under their own power but needed assistance navigating the rough terrain. The van's rear doors opened to reveal a space that had been reconfigured as a mobile medical bay. The nurses who had reached safety earlier had prepared improvised stretchers and medical equipment to treat patients during the dangerous journey ahead. Every inch of available space would be needed to accommodate the expanded group. As they loaded the wounded soldiers, shots rang out from the church building. Rebel fighters had discovered the empty basement and were now searching the surrounding area for their escaped quarry. Muzzle flashes appeared at several windows as the fighters tried to locate targets in the darkness outside. Maria helped Dr. Martinez secure his patients, while bullets struck the ground nearby. Her van's armored panels deflected several rounds that would have penetrated a civilian vehicle, but she knew they had only seconds before the rebel forces organized a more coordinated response. The engine was already running, and she was ready to move as soon as everyone was aboard. The last wounded soldier was pushed into the crowded cargo area, just as more rebel fighters emerged from the church and began advancing toward the van. Maria accelerated hard, spinning her wheels on the loose gravel as she turned toward the mining road that represented their only escape route. Behind them, automatic weapons fire erupted as the rebels realized their quarry was escaping. The first few hundred meters were the most dangerous, as Maria had to navigate through the town's narrow streets, while rebel forces converged on their position from multiple directions. She drove without lights, relying on her night vision equipment and intimate knowledge of the route she had planned during her approach. Several bullets struck the van's rear panels, but the reinforced structure held against the small arms fire. Once they reached the outskirts of Santa Rosa, Maria faced her greatest challenge yet. She would need to drive the treacherous mining road in complete darkness while carrying a full load of passengers, including seriously wounded men who could not survive a prolonged journey over rough terrain. The route that had been barely passable for her van alone would now test every modification that military engineers had made to the vehicle. Dr. Martinez worked frantically in the cramped cargo area, trying to stabilize his patients while the van bounced and swayed over the impossible road surface. The nurses held flashlights to illuminate his work, while bracing themselves against the violent motion that threw them repeatedly against the van's walls. Everyone understood that their lives depended on Maria's ability to navigate terrain that would have defeated most professional drivers. The climb toward the mountain pass pushed her engine to its absolute limits. The additional weight of 6 passengers and their equipment strained every component of the vehicle, but Maria adjusted her driving technique to accommodate the changed performance characteristics. She used momentum carefully, building speed on easier sections to carry them through obstacles that might otherwise stop their progress. Halfway up the mountain, the seriously wounded soldier began showing signs of severe internal bleeding that Dr. Martinez could not control with his limited supplies. The medical officer informed Maria that they would need to reach proper medical facilities within hours, or they would lose their patient. This added desperate urgency to an already nearly impossible journey. Maria pushed her van harder than she had ever pushed any vehicle, accepting risks that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. She accelerated across gaps where the road surface had collapsed, trusting her vehicle's momentum to carry them to solid ground on the other side. Several times the van's wheels spun freely over empty air before finding purchase on stable terrain. The descent from the mountain pass proved even more harrowing, with the van's increased weight making it difficult to control on the steep grades and crumbling road surface. Maria had to use her brakes sparingly to avoid overheating, instead relying on engine braking and precise steering to maintain control during the dangerous descent. As dawn broke over the eastern mountains, Maria's van finally reached the government checkpoint where her journey had begun what felt like days earlier. The soldiers stationed there called immediately for medical helicopters to evacuate the wounded, while military commanders gathered to hear the first reports of a rescue mission that had succeeded against impossible odds. Word of Maria's achievement spread rapidly through military command structures and eventually reached the highest levels of government leadership. The quiet delivery driver, who had once been invisible to her own colleagues, was now being discussed in strategy meetings where decisions affecting the entire conflict were made. Her success had demonstrated that unconventional approaches could achieve results that traditional military operations could not accomplish. Within weeks, Maria Santos became the most requested driver for special operations throughout the theater of conflict. Rebel forces began offering substantial bounties for information about the mysterious woman who appeared without warning to extract personnel and supplies from seemingly hopeless situations. Her name was spoken with respect in government facilities and with fear in rebel camps, but Maria remained the same person who had once sat alone in her van eating simple meals while her colleagues gathered around tables, sharing stories. The difference was that now she understood her own capabilities and the impact one determined individual could have on the lives of others. She had discovered that being unnoticed was not the same as being powerless. The seriously wounded soldier survived his injuries and would later return to active duty. Dr. Martinez and his medical team were safely evacuated to a major hospital where they could resume their work treating other casualties of the conflict. The mission that military planners had considered nearly impossible had been completed by someone they would never have selected for such a dangerous assignment. Maria's Mother Rosa watched the evening news one night and saw a brief report about an unnamed government driver who had rescued medical personnel from behind enemy lines. Though no names were mentioned, she recognized something in the reporter's description that made her smile with pride and worry in equal measure. Her quiet daughter had found her calling in the most unexpected circumstances. Over the following months, Maria completed dozens of missions that military historians would later describe as defining moments in the conflict. She evacuated wounded soldiers from positions that were about to be overrun, delivered critical supplies to units that had been cut off from support, and transported intelligence personnel to locations where they could gather information, essential for strategic planning. The van that had once carried packages through city traffic now bore scars from bullets and shrapnel, testament to the dangerous work its driver had undertaken. Military mechanics marveled at the punishment the vehicle had absorbed while continuing to function in conditions that would have destroyed any standard automobile. Like its driver, the van had proven capable of far more than anyone had initially imagined. As the conflict eventually moved toward resolution through negotiated settlement, Maria's role evolved from combat operations to humanitarian missions. She helped deliver food and medical supplies to communities that had been devastated by months of fighting, transported refugees to safe areas, and assisted in the complex logistics of reconstruction efforts. The woman who had once been invisible to her own colleagues had become a legend whose exploits were discussed around campfires by soldiers who had never met her but knew her reputation. Stories of her missions grew with each telling, but the core truth remained unchanged. A quiet delivery driver had discovered extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded everything she could give. When the last mission was completed and peace agreements were finally signed, Maria returned to her small apartment and her elderly mother. The city looked the same as when she had left it months earlier, but everything had changed for the woman who now knew exactly what she was capable of accomplishing when people depended on her skills and determination. The driver no one had noticed had become someone whose name would be remembered, long after the battlefields fell silent and the mountain roads returned to peaceful obscurity. Maria Santos had proven that heroism often comes from the most unexpected sources, and that the most important battles are sometimes fought by those who simply refuse to accept that some things are impossible.